It's a pretty important issue for our school district, and I'm glad to see the attendance. I'm not sure how many of you were here for the candidate forum, but we're going to kind of run things similarly. I'm going to hand out, one of our reporters, Alexander, is going to hand out note cards and pins. So what I'd like to do, what I'd like you to do with these is write down some questions as we kind of go through things tonight. We're going to break at about an hour into it, and then I'm going to collect the questions and go through them and kind of, figure out the best way to ask some of these questions that you guys submit. During the candidate forum, I got about 35 questions and had time to ask 3 of them in the second hour. So, make sure that the questions that you have aren't topics that we've already covered, and try to make them conversational points that can sort of spur some of the debate and thought up here on the stage. So Alexander's going to pass these out. And then I'll just tell you sort of the format that we're gonna work through tonight. I'm going to give a brief sort of overview of the bond. Just kind of the details from some of the detailed points from the school district's website. I'm not going to get too far into specifics because I think some of the specifics of the bond are what is the subject of the debate, and I'll let them handle that. I'll introduce our debaters, panelists, and then I'll let them explain their position on the bond. That'll take up about 15 minutes of our time, and then we'll start in with the questions. And so we'll do that for about an hour, and each person will get 3 minutes to answer the question and 1 minute rebuttal after everyone is gone, and we'll alternate proponents and opponents. So that's sort of the layout. So let's get to it. You'd think by now I'd have all this stuff memorized. So what we're looking at, this has been a topic of conversation in the community for, it seems like a decade, but it's not, I don't know that it's been that long, but we've got a bond that's before us. The bond is a elementary bond of $70 million, and the breakdown, according to the district's data, goes like this. Jim Darcy gets $17.9 million, and that's going to be a new 60,000 square foot K-5 school on the existing Jim Darcy site with a capacity of 500 students. Rossiter will get $5.7 million, and that's going to be a renovation, and their building capacity will be, I think, a renovation and some expansion. That building capacity will be at 500 students. Fort Georgians will get $3 million. Their capacity will be at 500 students. Broadwater will get $2.3 million. Their capacity will be at 352 students. Kessler will get $1.3 million. Their building capacity will be at 292 students. Hawthorne will get $660,000. Their building capacity will be at 292 students. Smith will get $14 million. Their capacity will be at 400 students. Warren will get $11 million. Their capacity will be at 450 students. Jefferson will get $2.7 million. Their capacity will be at 292 students. Bryant will get $1.1 million approximately. Their capacity will be 292 students. Central will get $8 million. Their capacity will be 352 students. Lincoln is going to get about $250,000. There'll be a technology center. There's a district-wide communication system component of this. That'll be $2 million. If you add all that up, that's $70 million. So our debaters or panelists tonight, debater sounds kind of high schoolish, but we'll stick with it. Starting over here on your left, Ellen Fever, who is on the Helena Public School Board. What? She's shaking her head.
Yesterday was my last day.
Oh, really? Somebody should tell the newspaper. I should even introduce myself. I'm Greg Lemon. I'm the editor of the IR. I pay really close attention to local events. So Ellen used to be on the school board. She's on a lot of boards in town, and or it was, I guess. But so, anyways, she knows the ins and outs of this, and she's been a part of this discussion for a while. Jennifer McKee is next to her. She is a communication specialist here in town. She has 2 kids, and she is a native Montanan. That's important to note. Alan Nicholson is next to her. Alan is, so I should say this, Jennifer and Alan are both proponents. Alan is an opponent, and I thank him for a little bio. He is from Roundup. He's a developer here in town. He identifies himself as a lifelong education advocate. Thank you, Alan. Next to him is Monica Trinnell. She's a local attorney, and she is also from Montana, and she has 2 kids in the district. So those are our debaters, and the proponents will start. Each person, again, is going to get 3 minutes to explain their position on the bond. Do we cover all the bases? Okay, let's get going.
I'm starting. I am very excited to be a proponent for this bond. It represents a wonderful thing that we can do for our children. I believe that our community needs to provide far better facilities for children's learning and their learning environment. It's most unfortunate that we've not built a new school in our community since 1978. My daughter, now a doctor serving this community, was almost 2 years old when the last new school was opened. The man who will be the principal at 4Gs next year went to elementary school there in our newest building. This is not a bond that closes schools. School closure is nowhere in the language. The school board has not voted to close a school. This bond invests in every elementary school. If a school closure discussion occurs at some time in the future, the public will have the opportunity to be involved in that discussion. There has been a concern expressed about the vision for the future for middle and high schools. When the legislature passed the bill doubling the elementary district bonding capacity, that vision became immediately discounted. Possibilities for our middle schools have changed dramatically, which also changes the conversation about high schools. This bond is a standalone bond. Its success in improving our kids' learning environment is viable no matter what future boards of trustees decide about middle and high schools. No one should vote on this bond based on assumptions for other schools for other times in the future. I maintain that the vision that the school board adopted for the future will change. The board will study next the needs of our middle schools and high schools, and in the years ahead bring proposals to the community related to those facilities. But our elementary schools are in the worst condition of all of our schools, and we have hundreds of displaced students who are not able to attend the elementary school closest to their home. The board chose to start addressing facility needs in the elementary schools for this reason. We should vote on this bond based on what it does for children now. The issue is kids and their well-being, physically and academically. We need to say yes for kids. The Helena Chamber of Commerce endorsed the bond proposal for 6 reasons. Children deserve the best environment. The quality of our schools is an important consideration for families potentially moving to Helena. The construction would have an economic impact for our community. High-quality schools attract employers, workers, and new business. The board recognizes, that being the chamber board, the financial impact of taxes, but it takes in a financial investment to move forward. Helena must begin to address school facility issues. In the last 40 years, our schools have assumed many additional responsibilities in taking care and educating children. We have not built new spaces to operate the new programs we've implemented. Our buildings are more than inadequate in many respects, and I have a number of examples.
Thank you, Ellen.
Thought that might be 3 minutes.
Yeah, it was a little over, but you were doing good. Alan.
Our schools are in very bad shape. The district has self-identified by line item, and for every elementary school, K through 8, $54 million worth of deferred maintenance. This bond proposes to spend $70 million. 62 of it, almost 90%, will be spent building 5 big high schools, or big elementary schools, sorry. I was a high school teacher. 5 big elementary schools on the periphery of town and in the county. It will spend the remaining, additionally, it will improve the structural integrity of Central School, and it will pay for a new communications system for the district, which is a phone system, really. That's $62 million. That's almost 90% of this bond. Will go to those 5 big schools, Central, which the district has over and over again said that it would become the administration building at some time, and the new phone system. The other $8 million is going to be spent on the remainder of the schools. There are 7 of them. The neighborhood schools and the 2 middle schools. The district apparently just doesn't agree that the middle schools are elementary schools. It says improves all elementary facilities reaching 3,400 students. Well, there are 4,900 students in the system. 3,300 of them actually live in this district. Well, let me back up a little bit on that. 3,300 of them live at the K-5 district, and the remainder live in a larger area for the middle schools. So we're going to spend $8 million on the 2 middle schools and on the other 5 schools, except that we're not going to spend any on the middle schools. The middle schools have $13 million of deferred maintenance identified by the district, line item. $1 million of that is for life safety issues as identified by the district, by line item. Nothing for those schools. The $8 million is really going to go to improve the other schools, elementary schools, the town schools, the smaller neighborhood schools. $8 million is the same amount that's being spent on Central alone. So the situation is we're going to spend $62 million on these big schools, structural renovations to Central, and a phone system, and we're going to spend $8 million on the remainder of the schools, including the middle schools. More than half of our kids go to those schools on which we're spending the $8 million. Those schools have nearly $30 million of deferred maintenance identified by the district. A couple of them get almost nothing, Hawthorne and Bryant. It is nothing compared to what the district has identified as the problems in those schools. As far as the follow-on bond, does that mean we're going to have these middle schools, which are now overcrowded, unsafe, deteriorating? We're going to have these middle schools for the foreseeable future with no input of funds? And this bond is standalone? It doesn't require any further bonding? Well, it certainly requires further bonding for the middle schools. The district's vision is to build 2 new high schools somewhere, to take the abandoned high schools and turn them into middle schools, take the middle schools and turn them into elementary schools. The cost for doing that, plus this $70 million bond, is $250 million. $250 million. It's going to cost $70 million today, $45 million apiece for the new high schools at least, and this is something I know something about. $45 million for the two high schools, that's 90, and 70 is 160. It's going to cost $50 million to take the old abandoned high schools and put them into middle schools. That's about 2/3 of what it would cost to build new middle schools. Helena High isn't suitable to do anything with. It's a rattle trap. But that's
Okay.
what we're going to do.
Alan,
And-
we're gonna move on, but you.
Could I just finish this idea?
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll come back to you too, so you got lots of time.
Okay, and then the cost for we're going to put the old middle schools into 4 elementary schools. If we spend 2/3 on each one that we're spending on Darcy, that'll be another $50 million. 50, 50, 90, and 70, $260 million. That's a lot to ask this community for.
Okay, Jennifer.
Well, as Greg said, I have 2 children, both of them go to Central, although neither of them have ever attended classes in their actual school building. Our entire experience at Central School and almost our entire experience with public education in Helena has been closure by crisis, dislocation, distrust, and some version of the very discussion that we're having tonight. It amazes me, actually it saddens me that Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, managed to reopen elementary schools that were closed by an actual earthquake faster than Helena, Montana can respond to an engineering report. I support this bond because I think we're done talking. This is the first time in 2.5 years that we have something before us as a community that does not call for closure and consolidation. It's the first time we have something before us that does not explicitly pit the town against the valley. Those of us who fought against consolidation, and I was one of them, even when it promised to reopen Central at the expense of Bryant, and those of us who fought to return Jim Darcy students to a proper school in their own neighborhood, well, we won that fight, and this bond before our community is the result of our win. I think we should take it. What this bond does is, as Ellen said, it touches every single school. It takes 5-year-olds at Kessler out of the basement and gives that school a proper door where people know who's coming and going. It replaces the collection of old and new modulars at Jim Darcy with a proper school, and it gives those students what everyone in town says they want, which is a neighborhood school. It means no more Jim Darcy parents are waiting in the dark with their kindergarten registration, hoping they got to school early enough that day to actually secure a spot in a classroom there. It means no more kids in Helena are going to come to school wearing coats and gloves all day long because their classroom is too cold to even sit still in, much less receive an education. And it'll mark the first time in our city's history that special needs students, who are 13% of our elementary school students, will have functional educational spaces built with them in mind so they can maximize their potential. On a sadder note, it will also guarantee that the places where they receive their most private sanitation needs are not visible to other students, which, believe it or not, is not true now, and that those spaces have running water available. That's not true now either. And yes, it will put Central back in Central. It will mean that we're no longer driving across a rail yard 720 times in a school year on our way to a building that is 6,000 square feet too small for us, that hasn't seen a single improvement with an elementary school student in mind since 1998, when it was abandoned as an elementary school. Our community has had some version of this conversation since 2007, before my soon-to-be third grader was even born. When she was a baby, people used to say to me, "Babies don't keep." Well, neither do elementary school students. The result of this decade-long conversation is our kids are just growing up. They're getting their entire education in infrastructure that everyone agrees is inadequate in almost every single instance. I think that Helena can and should do better. I think it's time that we do it. I think this bond meets everyone's needs.
Thank you. Monica.
Thank you, Greg, for hosting this debate. Good evening, everyone. I'm Monica Trenell. I will say that the fact that we have a debate over a bond in Helena and that we're talking about winners and losers says to me that something has gone seriously awry. Nevertheless, we have before us a binary decision. We vote yes or no on this bond. And every yes is a no, and every no is a yes to something else. Here's what I can say yes to. Can I get behind a bond? Yes, absolutely. Can I vote for a school bond? For sure. I can say yes to educating our kids in an optimal way. I can say yes to knowing the teachers that teach my kids in a small school, in a small classroom. I can say yes to knowing that I can email my principal, my daughter had a tough week. Will you take care of her, give her a hug? And I know that'll happen. I can say yes to that. I can say yes to the community of Helena that I moved to and I bought a home in. This small community that means community, we all come together, common, public, shared in the same way. I can say yes to the Helena community, our vibrant downtown. I can say yes to sustainable living. I walk to school, I walk to my work. I can say yes to watching my neighbors' kids grow up, go from kindergarten through 5th grade, get a dog in 3rd grade, lose their dog. I can say yes to watching all of that happen and knowing they're watching my kids grow up too. I can say yes to that. I can say yes to preserving our history, to preserving old buildings that have meaning, that have soul, that have purpose, that have big windows we see the sunshine in. And yes, we can fix them and make them so they don't get hot. Yes, I can say yes to that. I can say yes to all those things. Last year, when the custodian at Broadwater retired, my daughter came home and said, I'm sure gonna miss Mr. Mike. He took such good care of our building. Isn't that something that we should aspire to as a community? Can't we say yes to that? And because I can say yes to all of those things, I have to say no to this bond, because this bond rejects the community, the vibrant community downtown, the places that we walk to where we see our neighbors grow up. Here's why. I want to hand out a copy of the bond, which we got today from the county. So the board approved language in a bond proposal. This is very important. Pay attention. The board approved language for a bond, and they did that in March. That language was submitted to bond counsel for the board, Dorsey Whitney. Dorsey Whitney returned to the county the language that will go on the ballot. The language that went to the county is different than the language that the board approved. And this handout that I'm giving you shows how it's different. And in bold letters, you'll see five letters in bold in the middle. What has been added to the language that will be on the ballot, the 5 words down in the middle are, after the intro, asking for $70 million to improve our schools, to include, to the extent reasonably feasible. And we go on from there, what will be provided in this $70 million, to the extent reasonably feasible. Make no mistake about it. If it's not feasible to renovate Central, it won't happen. This language gives that option. Going back up to the language of the bond, let's look at the specific language that you're going to be voting for or against on June 18th.
Can we, I'm going to jump in. Let's get back to that, okay? Or,
Okay.
well, we can start the 1 minute, but we're beyond the 3, so.
All right.
I'll let you continue on with the 1 minute, and then we'll go back through and do 1 minute rebuttals.
All right. Okay. So because I want to say yes to Helena, to our community, to the place that I moved it to and want to educate my children in, I say no to this bond, and I ask you to do the same. Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else want to exercise that minute?
Sure.
Ellen, go ahead. We'll go back over, we'll alternate still on rebuttals.
Well, I'd like to make sure everybody knows that Central has not been designated as an admin building anytime in the future by the board. And, what conversations have evolved around is that Central, if Central were no longer used as an elementary school, we have many, many programs in our district that need good housing. And Central, as a rehabilitated building, would be a valuable asset to the district to use for many, there'd be many options. And also, I just think it's important that people keep in mind that the board chose to focus on elementary schools first and then middle schools and high schools. It's not that the board is going to ignore the middle schools, but just that the middle school buildings are in far better shape than the elementary schools. And the middle schools have requested additional staffing to meet student needs, and the board is working on providing that special staffing to meet middle school needs. So the middle schools are not being ignored.
Thanks, Alan. Alan,
Yes, the board should,
can you talk in your mic a little bit?
oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
The board should talk more to the superintendent, because as late as Friday, the superintendent said that when the next phase of the plan goes in, that Central will be the administration building. This is a consolidation plan. There are 3,300 kids in the K-5 district today. The demographic studies that the board has commissioned shows that will go to about 3,550 in a few years and then trail back down again. This plan builds 4,200 student capacity, 4,200 after this bond, if this bond is implemented. That leaves a lot of excess capacity. We're not going to leave every elementary school open. It's clear as a bell that it's aimed toward a consolidation plan. It would be fiscally infeasible to do that. You remember when the board was in this room talking about the necessity to get more money into the operating budget. The operating budget is what schools live on year by year. The money can't be mingled with any bond money or anything else. 92% of that goes to salaries and a lot more to building operations, a little bit's left for instructional purposes. And the board rightly said we need to make that a bigger number. This plan will cost more money for salaries. It will need 18 more teachers. It will spend more money on building the facility costs of a building, because now instead of having the schools that we have today, we'll have 5 schools, 3 of which are much bigger schools and will require much more money out of the part of the operations budget which is not devoted to instruction. So no board will let that go on for very long.
Okay.
This is a consolidation plan.
Jennifer.
Can I just make one point about that, to the extent reasonable? After Central was closed in one day, we wrote to the district and we asked for the engineering report to see what its findings were, and they happily gave it to us. And I'm not an engineer, but I've read the entire thing, and I also read the one from 2007 that the district gave to us. And it's reasonable to do this fix. It's more than reasonable to do a seismic retrofit for Central. It's actually $1 million fix. So as someone whose kids go there, I don't see how the phrase "to the extent reasonable" is anything other than boilerplate language in the bond. I mean, I don't think it means that Central's not going to reopen.
So I want to stick on there's a couple of good points raised. So let's flesh out maybe and they've also been points raised in the community, and also differences of opinion, and it sounds like facts. So we'll tread through some of that. School consolidation. I've heard people say that this plan does not consolidate schools. I've heard people say that this plan makes school consolidation inevitable. So we'll start this time with Alan. School consolidation, where do you see this plan as it impacts school consolidation?
Well, first let me say that I'm not necessarily against consolidating some schools. We probably do need to take it. We haven't looked at our attendance areas for years and years and years. We probably do need to close some schools and over time and build some bigger schools. That's really not the question here. But I think the community should be involved in deciding what that is, and it's not involved here. We're building all of the capacity, the majority of the capacity for this system at Smith, Fort Georgians, Jim Darcy, Rossiter, and Warren. That's where we're building it. Those are all going to be remodeled. The cost of remodeling there is $60 million bucks. $60 million bucks. We're going to spend $8 million on Central, and if you look at the bond language, all of those other schools talk about building classrooms, gymnasiums, all this stuff. The language for Central doesn't say anything about classrooms. It talks about structural upgrades, making handicapped access right. Just go look at that bond language and see what you think about that. But as I said earlier, we can't operate these bigger schools and all of the existing schools without costing us a lot more money. The superintendent has said we're going to take teachers who are teaching in the other schools and move them out to the big schools so we won't have all that extra expense for teachers at $60,000 a pop. Well, we've only got 75 teachers today in those other schools. So we're going to take 18 of them out of there. That's a fourth of those teachers. What's going to happen to those schools if we take a fourth of the teachers out of every one? Well, we won't do that. We'll close 2 of them. That's what we'll do. Now, it may be right, it may be wrong to close those 2, but it's certainly wrong not to let the public in on it, to imagine that we're going to vote for this bond and everything's going to be just wonderful. And just think of the level of commitment in terms of dollars here. $62 million for 5 big schools, Central, and a phone system. $8 million at Central of that $62 million. $8 million for everything else. And believe me, those middle schools were the topic of the first thing we were looked at for needs for building new buildings. They have $13 million with deferred maintenance, and $1 million of that's life safety issues. So to say we're just going to coast along here for years and years and years is just silly. C.R. Anderson is the biggest middle school in the state. It has about somewhere between 200 and 300 more kids in it than it's built for. What are we doing here? This makes no sense. It's a consolidation plan, pure and simple, without the input of the public.
Alan, Jennifer,
I'd like to speak to the issue of building capacity. When we describe in the bond materials the building capacity versus the number of expected students, I think that's an important concept to talk about. As I mentioned earlier, we have a number of programs in the district that did not exist when these buildings were built. And those additional programs need space. And so rather than having kids in seats in a traditional classroom, we need space for programs like life skills programs. That's a good example. We also don't want to build a brand new building and have it immediately filled to capacity. That's what happened in the case of 4 Georgians. And every child after that had to be shipped off to a different school. So what we are intentionally proposing is buildings with rooms that won't be empty. They will be used for collaborative space. If we ever get pre-K education, which hopefully we will have room to have pre-kindergarten children in our various school buildings.
okay. Monica?
On the question of capacity, this building we're sitting in tonight closed in the 1990s because of excess capacity in this district. Look at the Mosaic report, page 8 of that report. What we know, 8,000 kids in this district. It's been that way, projected to be that way into the future. Look at page 14 of the superintendent's report from January of 2013. Boundary adjustments. If we have enough capacity at Jim Darcy, the schools of Warren and Jim Darcy can handle the capacity in the valley. Why double the size of Smith? Why create 900 additional seats in Helena? We have adequate capacity today. Increasing capacity, increase costs, something has to give. We cannot increase capacity and leave all of the schools in the district open. Which ones will close? That's the reality, and we're not having that discussion. Thank you, Greg.
Jennifer?
I think we're on a path towards closure and consolidation right now if this bond doesn't pass. Next fall, half the students at Central will have never even been inside it. We are bleeding students over there. It's interesting that so many neighborhood school advocates express this great concern for Central, but they don't care every single day that our crisis continues. The boiler at Bryant has been teetering on its last legs for I don't even know how long. We are one crisis away from ad hoc closure and consolidation where there will be no public input. It'll just happen because we've got nothing else to do. We've been pressing our luck for a long time in this district, and our philosophy towards infrastructure has been no whammies. I don't think that's appropriate. I think closure and consolidation will happen more likely and sooner if we do nothing, if we postpone and keep talking, than if we pass this bond.
Rebuttal? Alan?
Well, I'm a big proponent of remodeling Central. It's in the downtown area. It's our oldest school. It's historic. It's a great building. So I would like to do that. But we can't, and we should do that, and we should have kids in it. We shouldn't have an administration building in there. That is in the center of town. It should have kids in it. I'm 100% for it. But if we spend $60 million on, or 52 really, on all of these big schools out here, and it leaves us with $8 million that we're spending on these other schools and another $8 million on Central, we can't do enough for the 7 schools that we're only putting $8 million in and still do all those other things. So I think a viable plan would be to rebuild Central, make it all across the country they've done this with schools that are historic. Make it into the finest school in the system. I would certainly be in favor of that in every respect. And do the same, don't leave these other schools out. Don't leave Jim Darcy out. You can do a lot of Jim Darcy to build capacity there without tearing down the school, buying more land, and building a brand new one at $18 million. There's a lot of things we can do here. Nobody's talking about not doing some of those things. We don't need a big school at Smith. We need a remodeled school at Smith. We don't need a big school at Warren. We need a remodeled school at Warren. We can do all the things we want to do. We just can't build this. And as far as excess capacity goes, I'm just taking that off what the superintendent put on his sheet. If you just add up what it says, student capacity, you get 4,200. Of course we're not going to put 4,200 kids in these schools, but we only have 3,300. That's 900 more. Maybe we could do with 700 more, I don't know, or 600 more. And as far as the extra space for extra programs in this district, all of it will be out in those schools. It will not be in these neighborhood schools down here. We're not building bigger built schools there.
Thanks. Alan, Jennifer?
Well, I see a lot of room for programs and improvements in the schools that are allocated less money under this proposal. You know, one of the things that I've seen with my grandsons is many of our specialists, our psychologists, speech pathologists, nurses, for example, work in spaces that were built as closets. When I accompanied my grandson to speech class when he was a preschooler, we had to move the furniture to fit 3 people in the room, and then move the furniture around again so we could close the door and have speech. And, you know, those kinds of things are allowed to be corrected in the money that's allocated to the various schools. I think those are important issues that need to be addressed.
Monica?
Let's get back to the language of the bond. If you look at it, what's in front of you, it says this $70 million will be spent in accordance with the district's educational facility guidelines. That document doesn't exist. I was highly motivated to find it, and I couldn't. It doesn't exist. So go through the bond language. What does it say about capacity, about what's being built? It talks about building classrooms at Jim Darcy, at Smith, at Warren, and at Rossiter. No language about classrooms at Central. Nothing about a school at Central. The remainder of the schools, a technology lab, if it's reasonably feasible to do so after all of that fancy construction has happened out in the valley. So Hawthorne, you might get an iPad, call it good. This bond doesn't do anything for the schools in town. It doesn't talk about building the schools that we have and taking care of the infrastructure that we have today.
Thank you. Jennifer?
I think the reason that it doesn't talk about classrooms at Central is because there won't be an increased number of classrooms. It will just be the same number of classrooms, and that's why you're not seeing the language on the bond.
All right. So one of the topics that has been brought up and has been a hot topic of discussion has been displacement of students. And we all know that there's a huge problem within the district of students that have to go to school outside of their elementary district. So there's also been plenty of discussion back and forth on whether or not the bond addresses the displacement of students, makes it better, or makes it worse. So, be over here to the proponents. Jennifer, you should go first. Do you think the bond is going to improve or address the displacement of students, and how?
Yes. It will reopen Central and all of us will go back to our school, and it will expand the capacity in Jim Darcy where it's direly needed, and no one would argue that, and all of those students will also go back to their school. They'll no longer be leaving their school day 15 minutes early so they can hop a bus and be on it for an hour and change.
Okay, Monica Allen?
Well, the district says that this will allow, it doesn't talk about displaced students per se, I don't think, but says it'll allow students to attend closer to the homes. The only students that will attend closer to the homes, Jim Darcy is one, and Warren is one. Warren has 369 kids in its enrollment zone. It only has, I don't know how many of those would come into other schools anyway, but there'll be a few more kids out there. Darcy has 566 kids in its enrollment zone, and it only has capacity for around 300 and some, and that includes a bunch of these modular buildings. So certainly we need to do something at Darcy. I will say, though, that in general, you know what an attendance area is? It's a geographic area around a school that kids in that district are allocated to that school, so to speak. About between 20 and 30% of the kids in this district do not go to school in their enrollment zones or attendance areas. In fact, the school that has the smallest percentage of kids in its attendance area that go to it is our school down there. I always forget which one that is, pardon me, but it's Jefferson. And I'm a fan of Jefferson's. I knew him as a boy, and actually, Jim Darcy, if you look at Jim Darcy and Rossiter together, they have this, 84% of the kids at Jim Darcy today go either to Jim Darcy or to Rossiter. Rossiter are 3 miles apart down a paved highway. That's the 16% is the smallest percent of kids in any enrollment zone in this city or attendance area that are not going to school in their attendance area. I'm not saying by that that I think we shouldn't do anything at Darcy, for sure. But this is not the problem that we thought it was earlier, if you look into it. All of the other schools now have more and more capacity than there are kids in them, except for Fort Georgians, and they're not going to change the capacity of Fort Georgians. Right today, we have more capacity in our public schools than there are kids. We have more capacity in our public schools than there are kids expected to be here for the next umpteen years. Ellen's right. We need to have more diverse spaces. We need to have extra space. But 900 seats, almost all of them out on the edge of town and in the valley? No. And this is not town versus valley. This is just we're making a mistake here, guys. We're spending very little money in the center of town. We're going to have schools that have $8 million spent on them and have a total of almost $30 million that the district has identified in deferred maintenance in these same schools. And we're going to make them livable for kids. We have $1 million of life safety issues and $13 million of deferred maintenance in the middle schools. We're just going to let that go for the next umpteen years until we get around to having another bond? Honestly, I'm just puzzled by all of this.
Ellen.
Well, I'd like to talk about life safety a little bit.
Okay.
And, our buildings were built at a time where our biggest concern was fire. So they have lots of exits. And today, our concern, after Sandy Hook and other horrible events, our concern is who's in our buildings. And we need buildings that are in the line of sight of our offices, monitored entrances, and we need some ability to have surveillance equipment in some of our schools so that we know who goes in and out of our buildings. That is a safety issue that is going to be addressed for every single elementary school if we pass this bond. Another issue that will be addressed for every single school in the elementary category is every school will have a technology lab. Today, along with inadequate heat, inadequate cooling, ventilation, water, there's electricity. We don't have enough outlets in our buildings to recharge portable computer devices. And we don't have computer labs that are needed for student research and writing projects and state testing. Our children need the technology tools to succeed, and this bond includes technology labs in every single elementary school. These are huge improvements that are needed for our educators to be able to do their jobs and for our students to succeed in today's world.
Monica.
I'll talk about displacement since that was a question that I think was posed. What this bond does, it buys us busing. More students will be bused further under this bond than is happening today. Here's why. Smith is going to double in size. Where are those kids going to come from? If you look at the superintendent's report from 2013, it's set out there that Jim Darcy, the students in Jim Darcy attendance area 526, enrollment 302, attend Jim Darcy 289, incoming from outside attendance area 12. Why are 12 kids coming from outside Jim Darcy into Jim Darcy? What's going on? We don't know. What we do know is 70% of the students in our district are in their area. 16% of our elementary students, about 550 kids, are going elsewhere by parent choice. Why? Montessori, Rossiter, Broadwater, Jefferson offer preschool care. Some parents work and need to drop their kids off early and do that. They take that choice. 14% of the students are placed by the district. What is the problem? Why is it a problem? Who's being bused where? For what reason? Where are the answers to those questions? And shouldn't we have that information before we close a bunch of schools in town, which is what will happen here? Don't think otherwise, and start busing our kids out to the perimeter of town.
Rebuttal?
You know, I think if you took all the parents of displaced students, all the parents who have skin in the game of displacement, and you had them read through this bond, they would tell you that it solves their problem. I mean, I don't think that it makes new busing consolidation problems. Frankly, I think if our school board had the political savvy to perpetrate a secret consolidation plan and a $70 million bait and switch fraud on all of us, they would have solved these complicated problems a long time ago.
Alan, Monica?
Well, so where are we on this? Are we at 1 minute or 3 minutes?
We're at one.
Okay,
Well, it's been more like one-ish.
okay. Well, you know, nobody's talking about not taking care of displaced students. We should do that. The question would be whether we should displace more students. That, you know, whether we should be busing kids, say, from Bryant, which I believe will happen right away, over to Smith. That would be a question that's worth asking. Nobody wants to not build adequate capacity in schools that have displaced students. There are two of them. Warren has a few, and Jim Darcy has a lot. I'd like to go back to the safety issue. Here's a line item. This is what the district says he's doing at the two at the two middle schools. I'm sure some of you can read this, right? I can hardly read it here. Here are some of the line items. Lead paint abatement, 100 grand. Fire alarm replacement, 67,000. Fire rated doors, 120,000. Fire rated doors are a big deal in buildings. Fire main supply isolation valve, 18,000. In C.R. Anderson, lead paint abatement, 100 grand. Asbestos removal, $89,000. Those aren't addressed at all. There's not a penny to address any of those. And that's only $1 million or $13 million that are on this sheet for those two schools. And those same things are happening at a lot of these elementary schools. At Bryant, we're gonna, or at Hawthorne, we're gonna, the bond calls for spending $642,000. That's what the bond calls for. The district has identified $3,066,277 worth of deferred maintenance at Hawthorne. That's a pretty big difference. Hawthorne's going to get closed, and it's going to get closed pretty darn quick, in my opinion.
Okay.
Can I just piggyback on that really quickly?
Sure.
Okay, and I would just point out that the funds as proposed to be allocated in the February proposal, which is different than the bond, supposing they stay within that proposal, $18 million at Jim Darcy to take care of 70 kids being bussed out of the district. Does that make sense?
Alan.
That, Monica, $18 million isn't for 70 kids. It's for all the kids in Jim Darcy, and that's close to 500 kids. And, you know, since 2002, we have been talking as a district about Jim Darcy and how we need better buildings for the kids who live in that area. A whole generation of kids has gone through school in inadequate facilities. We need to take care of the Jim Darcy kids. They're our kids, and it's a crime that they have had to wait so long. I mean, Central kids have had to wait a long time for a decent facility, but Jim Darcy has waited far longer. And, you know, I just think that we need to start talking about students. So many of our students suffer in the first 2 weeks of school and the last 2 weeks of school in 90-degree heat. So that's 12% of their school year. And then during the winter, they wear their coats and their mittens in the classroom because we have inadequate heating. We also have inadequate ventilation. These issues will be addressed by the bond. At 4Gs and at other elementary schools where we have special needs kids, and you heard just a little bit about that earlier, there are K-5 students who wear diapers and must be changed every day. At 4Gs, the life skills room is across the hall from the changing room. The changing room is also a storage room, and there is no water there. Can you imagine changing the diaper of a 5th grader without water? This is criminal. We need to address these facilities, and this bond will do that.
All right. So, there you are. We'll take a break. I'll collect your questions. There's cookies, coffee. There might be a few crumbs left. So we'll take a little break, and then we'll reconvene. I'll try to be loud again and get you back to your seats. I had about twice as many questions than I did through the candidate forum. But there was some really well thought out questions that hit onto 3 different areas. And so I'm going to deviate a little bit from our setup here because we've spent a lot of time debating the current bond, and but the opponents have not had a chance, nor have I asked them to really explain what they would do instead. So what I'd like to do is to have them explain what their alternative would be, and then I'd like so the proponents will then turn into the opponents, and then you would respond. So, Alan, Monica, I'll give the 2 of you 3 minutes back to back, so 6 minutes total.
Okay. Let me get my head together here just a little bit. It's not a simple job.
The clock's, and thank you very much. So the other thing I've heard from our kind citizens here is that the audio is a little better when you're closer to the mic. So, Monica, I think they hear you really well. I think everybody else could be.
I'm sorry.
No, it's actually, it sounds loud, but it's because the mic, but it's really good. It's perfect.
Well, I'll remind you that Monica is a lawyer, so she's
Right.
used to loud. I'd just like to point out for the record that Nancy and I have 2 grandchildren in town, and they're both Central students. We're very disappointed with the conditions in which they're going to school now, and very much want them to be in better conditions. The older, by the way, they're the smartest kids in town, and also the cutest, I just gotta admit it, but we would like them to be in better conditions.
A little closer to the mic, Alan. Just get right up there.
So in terms of alternatives, I have an opinion about that which is not shared by everybody, and that is we really should develop the alternative as a community. We should have community discussion, and if I get a chance, I'll say more about that in closing remarks. But in terms of just doing an alternative, it could be done very quickly. If we're going to have the top-down alternative from the board that we have now, they could do this in pretty short order, and we could be voting on it. I don't know how long it would take, but maybe 3 months, 6 months, I don't know. Anyway, as an alternative, I would make the following observations. We just can't not do something. Is that right to say that can't not?
Yeah.
Okay. We can't let C.R. Anderson and HMS just go to seed. We can't do that. So I would spend more money there. So what does that mean, you'd spend more money there? Well, it means we'll spend more money there. I would spend $18 million between the 2 of them. And, of course, it has to come from somewhere. So where would it come from? Well, Broadwater is slated right now to get in this bond $1,129,000 more. Well, let me backtrack. The bond proposal spends $2,301,000 at Broadwater. I would spend $3.4 million there. Bryant gets $166 million, $1,166,000. You can tell I'm getting tired. I'm an old man. I would spend $3,400,000 there. Central gets almost $8 million, and I would spend $4 million there. You could do everything you're doing for structural there and do some remodeling of the classrooms for that. And that's where my kids go. Fort Georgians, the bigger school, the district plans to spend $3 million. I would spend $3.5 million at Fort Georgians. Hawthorne, they plan to spend $642,000, and I would suggest something like $3.4 million there, which is quite a bit more, almost $3 million more. You could actually do something for that. Jefferson, spending $2.6 million. I would spend $3.4 million there. Jim Darcy, spending $18 million. It's a quarter of all the bond funds. I would spend $14 million at Jim Darcy. I would remodel the existing building, which the Mosaic study said is in good shape, and I would add classrooms, and I would make a 4-3 school at Jim Darcy. The estimate for building a new school at Jim Darcy in the Mosaic plan, which was the plan 2 or 3 years ago, was $12 million. Kistler, spending $1.3 million. This is another school that's going to close. $3 million there. Rossiter, $5,721,000. The district says $3,920,000 is what I'd spend. That's almost $2 million less. Smith, there's no reason to build a big school at Smith. They have one of the smallest enrollment in their enrollment area of any school in the whole district. I would spend $4 million there doing what needs to be done to that school to make it bring it closer to standards. Warren is another school. There's no reason to expand Warren. Warren has 350 or 60 students in it. We're gonna build it a 500 student school there? No. I'd spend $4 million there. And on the district-wide thing, they say it's gonna cost $2.2 million. I'm not gonna argue with that. So if you add all those numbers up, which I'm sure some of you had done in your head, they add up to about $70 million. Actually, if I were on the board, I'd bond for the whole amount, 75 or 74 million. And with the increased bonding capacity, I'd probably go for more than that. You have to temper that with what the public will do. So you spend more at every school, except you spend $4 million less at Central. You spend $4 million less at Darcy. You spend $2 million less at Smith. You spend almost $7 million. You spend $10 million less at Smith, $2 million less at Rossiter, and $7 million less at Warren. So you spend 7 less at Warren, 10 less at Smith, and so on. So you get about the same place, and you spend almost $18 million in the middle schools. Now, every school, what the district is saying about this bond plan happens in a bond plan like that. Every school gets remodeled. Every school gets enough money to at least, except for Central, which has almost $10 million in identified deferred maintenance. Even the $8 million wouldn't cover all that. You don't get too close. But every other school, you meet pretty much the deferred maintenance costs that the district has identified. Now, I don't think you should do it that way. I think you should you should do all life safety issues. You should do maybe a half, if you can, of the deferred maintenance things. You should let the things go like that you can, because really, for 21st century schools, you need to have schools that have flexible spaces. All schools, the 5 big schools will have that, but the rest of the schools won't. And you need new furnishings. And you can buy furnishings with a bond. You need furnishings that will allow collaborative learning, allow people to put things together. And you can do that for somewhere in the neighborhood of $750,000 a school. So all of those things would be incorporated in this bond scenario. This is one of a whole bunch of bond scenarios you could come up with. You could do it all day long. You could have contests about it. What's wrong with this bond that we have today is that it just spends too darn much money in too few places. It gives us big winners and big losers. And why are we going to do that? I don't think we should do that.
Monica, you want to add to that?
Thank you, Greg, and I apologize for shouting. And I would like to say, we all want to vote yes, don't we? I do. I want to vote yes to a bond. And Ellen, you're right. We care about Jim Darcy. We all care about each other's kids. We're a community that cares about each other, and we want to vote yes for this. Here's a way that we can make that happen. Look at the Mosaic report. We paid for it. It's an excellent starting point. This product is very well done, very well thought out. Starting at page 96, there are recommendations. At page 95, there are recommendations on a path forward that works. A new middle school, $16 million. That's an immediate need in our district, less than Jim Darcy. But it also addresses the needs at Jim Darcy, which we need to do. We all agree on that. Here are some things that we need to look at. We need to address the immediate needs in the middle school and the high schools. And some of the recommendations in the Mosaic report are very thoughtful and go in that direction. We need to talk about special programs. Where is the gifted and talented program going to end up? That's a huge concern that needs to be addressed, and Closing Ray Bjork is not going to take care of that program. That's a program that needs to be vibrant and alive, and it needs to be funded. Montessori, that's a program that is very popular in Helena. Let's keep that going. Let's get rid of this idea, this crazy idea of standardization. I shop at Costco for my cereal, for my tomatoes, my tomato sauce. I don't want my kids going to school there. We can do better. Common Core is not a curriculum. Let's let our teachers teach. We have fabulous teachers here, and we pride ourselves on paying them well. Let them go. Don't hold them hostage to the idea that the Common Core is a curriculum. It's not. Let's meet the special needs of all of our kids. And yes, we ask so much of our public schools. We ask them to take on Herculean tasks. Our teachers are so wonderful. I love being able to email and text my teacher and say, hey, my kid had a rough night. Can you give her a hug? And she responds. That's so great. Let's keep those things going. Bryant, those kids need to be educated where they live. There's no question about that. We can't be talking about busing those kids out of district. Let's build a school there for them. So those are some of the immediate needs, but I would say start with the Mosaic Report. This is a good product, and it was done locally.
All right, Alan, Jennifer, you pick who starts.
First, I'd like to explain what the district facility guidelines are, and I think that's the language used in the bond that we're going to vote for, the bond language. The district facility guidelines, since Montana has no building guidelines for schools, we looked around at other states to find guidelines to be able to assess what would, in looking at every building the same way, with the same set of standards, what would we need to do to bring all of our schools up to the same standard? We found that the standards in Wyoming, where there are wonderful facilities, Wyoming citizens have invested mightily in great school buildings. And Ohio, oddly enough, there was a blend of those guidelines that we put together and our school board adopted. I don't know that it's in a book anyplace, but we adopted that as policy and agreed that every one of our elementary schools should be assessed using those guidelines. And that's where all the recommendations for improving schools came from. We were not able to bring every school up to 100% because we simply have more needs than at the time we had bonding capacity. But we made a few choices, and every school that we looked at was assessed according to those criteria. So in looking at the money that we would propose spending at Rossiter, Rossiter has a lot of kids there, and they don't have enough space. And the guidelines that we used said that Rossiter needs more space to adequately address the needs of kids there. If you've been to their technology center, it's a big closet. And their library is not large enough for the students that are there. There are many issues at Rossiter that need to be addressed to make that school adequate for the kids. Warren children are bused past their school to Smith right now. We have a number of displaced kids from Warren, and Warren needs more space so they can have their own neighborhood kids in their school. Why would we spend $8 million at Central? I think that is a very key question. Once you take, and I'm clearly not a builder, once you take all the walls down to address the earthquake structural issues, you've exposed all the pipes, the wires, everything that is inadequate and very, very old and doesn't work well anymore at that school. To not fix all of that stuff, I mean, every single building system needs to be replaced at Central. And when the walls are all exposed, it just makes sense to me as a fiduciary, if I were still on the school board, that you would do it then and not have to tear the walls down again in order to fix the wiring or some other thing. And $8 million is what it costs to restore the number of classrooms that were there before and make them appropriate for today's learning environment. Smith School is our most expensive building to maintain. If you look at the way it's structured, you know, it's got lots of different pods. And I think there are at least 6 boilers at Smith. And they're all the same age. It is the utility bills for Smith far outstrip any other utility bills for any other school. It just was not built in an efficient manner. It has a pretty darn good gym, but the rest of it, I think we'd be a lot better off if we just started over.
Jennifer?
Well, it's hard to accurately go through point by point on the other plan, although I do agree with what Mr. Nicholson and with what Monica said. We're not really, I don't view the 4 of us as opponents to the end goal. We have just got a lot of problems on our plate, and we've kind of reasoned ourselves to different ways of getting to the same place. Quickly, I think the notion of building a brand new middle school in the valley, it's my understanding that our operating budget could not support that, and you really would have to close a school in town if you wanted to do that. But as for the rest of it, you know, I don't think the current bond is exactly perfect. I think we've been talking for so long that if there was a perfect popular plan, we would have passed a long time ago. We are all left with some version of imperfect. And I can't say, I haven't had a chance to study the other plan. I can't say if it's more or less imperfect than the one that's before us. But I do know that it isn't perfect either. It will draw out its own enemies. It will draw out its own supporters. But most importantly, it will draw this conversation out. And it's already been going on for a very long time. It's just sort of heartbreaking when I look at the future and think, my kids will never see the inside of their own elementary school. That's probably true even if this bond were to pass. My oldest probably won't go there. But to think about going back to the drawing board and having another 2 or 3 years of quote-unquote community involvement, which is really just a community fight, you know, what will happen in the meantime? Our situation has only gotten worse since we started talking about Jim Darcy in 2002 and since we started talking about the rest of it in 2007. I think at a certain point, we just have to make peace with the imperfection that we're left with as a community. And whichever path our community takes, I just hope we hurry up and take it.
Hey. Keep it down, keep it down. Alan, Monica, do you guys?
Well, I would like to vote for this bond too. You know, this is.
Talk into your mic, Alan.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I'd like to vote for this bond too, but I can't. You know, we're not talking about something that if we don't like it, we can just undo it. We're gonna live with this for 50 or 75 years. Some of you are, I'm not. This proposal is so lopsided. It is so favorable to some areas and so unfavorable to others. It will split this community for the foreseeable future, and I would like at the end of this to say something more about this. I didn't say anything about building a new middle school in this plan, and this is not really a plan. This is just an example of what a plan could look like. If I had my druthers, I would go back, hire professionals, and go do a true community conversation, not just talking at the board and for 2 or 3 minutes and having the board sitting there taking it in or not taking it in and not responding in any way. That's not how you build community consensus. It doesn't matter at this point whether we pass this bond or not, in the sense that if this bond is on the ballot, this community is permanently split. We haven't experienced yet what kind of dislocation and splitting issues between people of good faith that just voting on this bond will do. If you vote for this bond and it passes, you've won the battle, but you've lost the war. If you vote against this bond and it fails, you have won the battle, but you've lost the war. This vote will create lasting divisions among parents, teachers, and perhaps most alarmingly, between the most faithful and ardent supporters of public education in this community. It's being on the ballot, and it appears that we're past that. So I'm sad for that. I have no illusions about winning anything here. I just think this bond is so bad and will so damage the educational fabric of this community that I will do with whatever energy I can muster, I will try to get it defeated.
Monica?
There are good reasons and bad reasons to vote for something. A bad reason is to get out of stasis and paralysis. The right way forward may be difficult. We're frustrated. We're exhausted. But we can do this together as a community, and this bond is not the answer. It would be a travesty if this passes at 51% of the vote. It'd be a travesty if it failed, and that if the opposite. Nobody wants that. We can all get together here. We can get a bond that will pass, that is good for everybody, and that we can all get behind. It's not this bond. So vote no reluctantly. Vote no with a heavy heart. Vote no wanting to get out of this paralysis. But vote no in order to say yes to all of our kids across the district.
So that sounded like closing statements, but we're not quite there yet. So, Ellen and Jennifer, another minute or two?
Well, it's clear that we don't have the resources to bring every building up to the standards that the school board adopted for our buildings, but we can get started. If we don't take one step, we'll never be able to take the second step. We really need to invest in our schools. This bond represents an excellent start in addressing very old buildings. It includes furniture. It is a bond where right now, next year, my younger grandson will attend kindergarten in a basement with 2 high windows that do not open. So almost no natural light, and a stairwell that is so skinny, I have never seen another stairwell like that. This bond would address that situation. It would build new kindergarten rooms up in the daylight where kids are really going to be safe. This is something that is very near and dear to many of our hearts. Our staff don't deserve to teach in a windowless basement. And we have staff all over the district. Very, very talented people. We hire the very best. The cream of the crop are our educators. And we put them in a windowless basement all day long. That's wrong.
Jennifer?
I don't know, it's hard to top my last one. I got I got clapping on that one. I don't personally follow the logic that this bond splits our community. I feel like our community is already split, and it's split at a very young level. I'm a Girl Scout leader of a combined Central Jefferson troop, and we were brainstorming what to do with the money that we made from our cookie program. And we meet at Jefferson, and our Jefferson girls were saying, let's spend money on Jefferson. And our Central girls blew their tops. You guys already have a school. What do you need money for? This is being felt in a very personal way to all the students at our community, and especially those who are displaced, who know they are displaced, who know this place where they're receiving their education is woefully inadequate. They know that it's not up to par. And I just think it's time to do something. I think this bond does enough of what we want to get behind it. I also think it's important to remember that even if all the parents agreed on a plan, we're 30% of the voters. We're going to have a huge lift ahead of us no matter what we agree upon.
So I wanted, we're going to run out of time with this last question, and there was 2 other areas of questions that we got. One was sort of a kind of a broad, big picture planning question, and one was, I would characterize it as a big picture responsibility question. So I'm going to kind of introduce both questions with just a little commentary. So we've talked about the deferred maintenance, and everybody seems to agree that there's deferred maintenance that needs to be addressed. the questions that we've gotten have implied that deferred maintenance has come because of a lack of planning or forethought on school boards, not just this school board, but school boards and school board members for the questions said last 40 years, and it might be hard to argue with that. So the other question talked about planning from the sense of that when schools like Jim Darcy and Warren and Rossiter were built, that our community looked very different then. And so rebuilding is a vision for the future. So we'll start in this sort of gingerly, it appears. So rebuilding schools where they exist now the question is that the appropriate vision for the future? Does it encourage sprawl? Do we need new schools where we already have old schools? Do we need to rethink things? This is an opportunity. The second part of that question is, and maybe this encapsulates everything, is do we have how do we ensure as citizens, how do we ensure that the school board is not thinking just about that this bond, and the school board who will be responsible for seeing this bond through, how do we ensure that they're thinking about those sorts of big picture items, big picture things like planning and where we're going to grow and how we're going to grow, and how we're going to maintain and not wind up in these deferred maintenance issues down the road. The question is does this bond begin that process? I hope that made sense. It's a big question. Ellen or Jennifer?
Well, I would start on
No, Ellen, sorry.
Oh, Ellen.
Yeah.
Not only can't speak loudly, I can't hear.
I maintain that this bond gets us on the way to where we need to be. Where should our schools be? Our schools should be where our kids are. We have so many children who don't have a school near them or an inadequate school near them. And the school board has hired demographers. They've done demographic studies about where kids are predicted to be in the future. I don't understand all the magic they go through to do that, except that they study where young people own houses and old people own houses. And when you have a lot of old people, it's not going to be long till they're young people there. They study the cost of housing here and there and project where kids will be. And the schools that are proposed to have the big investments in this bond is where kids are and where they're projected to be. And if I had my way, if I were queen, I might have everybody live in town, because we have good sewer systems and water systems and all that kind of stuff. But, I'm not queen. And people already live where they live. The cows are out of the barn, so to speak, and our children are the ones that we need to keep in mind. We need to do this for our children, all of our children, wherever they live in our community, in our school district. And the bond addresses those kids where they live.
Ellen or Monica?
Well, I would respond to that. The deferred maintenance is so high
Ellen, can you
because we haven't done
talk
it.
into your microphone? Talk into your microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
The deferred maintenance is so high because we haven't done it. We pass a bond or a levy every 10 years. We passed one a couple of years ago for $12,500,000. It's not a bond, it's a levy. It counts against the bond limit. That gives us $1,250,000 a year to spend on things that are wrong with the schools. New things go wrong with the schools. If you have $1 million worth of deferred maintenance today and you don't do anything, you have $2 million in 10 years. And that's what's going to happen in these schools, most of these schools. The schools where it's not going to happen, of course, are the new schools. It's not going to happen at the 6 big schools because those schools are going to be fully remodeled. It's just going to continue to happen in the rest of the schools. And as far as buildings, the demographic report did not suggest that we should build a big school at Smith or that we need a big school at Smith. It did not suggest that we need a big school at Warren. The only two schools that have more kids in their enrollment areas, again, are Darcy and Warren. Warren doesn't have very many more kids in its enrollment area than it has room in the schools. Darcy does. No other school does. What are we talking about here? We're going to let the middle schools and the other elementary schools just die on the vine. We have $1 million a year total for all these schools, K through 8. It's a drop in the bucket. We're going to be further behind every year. We're still going to have $30 million of deferred maintenance in these schools, less whatever of the $8 million we spend on deferred maintenance, which if you look at the plan is not all that much on deferred maintenance. We're going to build some new space, we're going to do some things. We're talking about safety in the schools, and we're going to put light and things, that kind of thing in there. This doesn't do it. At Bryant is a place where we really heard that the kids are too hot in the spring, or is it the other way around, and too cold. Anyway, they're in rooms where the temperature is too high or too low to have an environment for teaching that can actually work. You know what the plan to do at I'm not getting the school right there. It's well, it is Bryant. I'm sorry. Yeah, I had it right. What do you know? We're going to put shades on the windows. That's what we're going to do there. We're going to spend, at Bryant, we're going to spend $1,166,000. We have almost $2.7 million worth of deferred maintenance alone. So, and those are the kids that have the most difficult circumstances under which to grow up, let alone go to school. A lot of them can't make it to school, even though they're close. A lot of those kids get dropped off at the school at 6 and 7 in the morning because their parents work. They're taken in by neighbors. Ellen is worried about whether we are busing a few kids, 15 or so, from Warren to Smith. Big deal. Almost every kid at Warren is driven or bused to Warren. I don't care whether they live in the Warren district or not. Just go out there. And you can go out to Jim Darcy as well and see how many kids you think in the Jim Darcy district, which is 3.5 times bigger than the whole city of Helena, can walk to that school. Not 1%.
Okay.
So I want to say one more thing. We're going to build this big school at Smith, and so we don't have to bus a few kids from Warren there. Who are we going to bus there? We're going to have capacity in that school, which is nearly twice what the number of students in that area is. Who are we going to bus there? We're going to bus another couple hundred kids there, and I'll tell you where they're mostly going to come from. They're mostly going to come from Bryant.
All right, Jennifer.
Well, if the question was, is this bond going to help address or help be some part of the discussion about urban and suburban development, do I understand that correctly?
No,
Or kind of-ish?
yeah. I mean, I think let me rephrase it as clearly as I remember. So the gist I'm trying to put together is years and decades ago there was a plan and a need for a school. They built a school. Communities built up around it. Some of those plans, whether it was an inadequate thought process at the time to build a 300 capacity school at Jim Darcy, the fourth thought didn't see that kind of sprawling development. How do we ensure that does this bond ensure that those sorts of decisions, because we're going to be making permanent decisions that are, the life of a school building is 40, 60 years. I mean, in Helena, it's 100 years or so. So is this decision, are these decisions under this bond have that kind of time frame in mind, both with the thoughtfulness of where the community is going to develop or could develop, or how is it going to develop, or where should it develop, and how to keep track of the maintenance and the upkeep so we don't end up in 60 years into this spot.
Well, in the case of my own school, there were kids going to school at Central 100 years ago. There's still kids who want to go to school at Central. But one of the things I think that has made this conversation for our community so difficult is that our school board, to their credit, didn't do anything until they could do all the things. We got to solve all the problems at all the middle schools and all the elementary schools, or we can't do anything. And I got to tell you, it brings a chill to think that we can't do anything until we also solve all the problems in Lewis and Clark County. I don't think we should hold our school improvements hostage to that end game. I don't think it's even really possible to anticipate where people are going to live in 100 years. We know they're probably not going to raise the houses in the town or in the valley, so we got that going for us.
All right, Monica.
The question about deferred maintenance, it doesn't matter why we're here. Today we need to address deferred maintenance. Here's why this bond should, here's why you should vote no to this bond, and here's why it doesn't do that. In January, the board considered a $76 million bond, said, no, that's too much, come back with a $70 million proposal. February 28th, compare those two documents. They're online. Look at the February 28th document. All of the deferred maintenance is removed. What this bond language does, read it. It says, in accordance with the district's educational facility guidelines, we now know that they're not in writing. What are they? What's to hold anybody to spending the money as suggested it ought to be spent in this February document, which doesn't address deferred maintenance? This is an open checkbook, and specifically it doesn't address deferred maintenance. The bond language talks about 4 schools that will get classrooms. The remainder of the schools, there's nothing to hold anyone to spending any money on any of those schools. That's why I'm asking you to vote no to this bond. It's why I can't support it.
Okay. Rebuttals?
Well, one of the points that I think is important to think about is deferred maintenance is always greater on old buildings. If we build some new schools finally, we won't have so much deferred maintenance. And a lot of the numbers that were in the Mosaic report just disappear because we have new buildings. We need to continue to maintain our buildings. Fortunately, we had the levy passed that funds those things that happen, like boilers getting too old. And we will continue to have deferred maintenance, and unfortunately, the older our schools, the more deferred maintenance we will have. We need to do something to cut that off. We need to build new schools. We need to invest in modern schools so that our kids will be winners. We don't need them to have a learning environment that is a bad place.
Monica?
The deferred maintenance costs in the Mosaic report disappear if the schools disappear. That's the only way it goes away.
I would,
Well, let's get to Jennifer. You don't have to do a rebuttal if you're...
I wave off.
you know, I did a dumb thing. I came to town and remodeled the Power Block West, the Gold Block, the New York Block, the Securities Building, all historic buildings. The Power Block's older than any school in town. It's 120 years old. They're great buildings. They're very viable buildings. They have up-to-date systems in them. I don't even know how to respond to the idea that we have to build new buildings in order to deal with deferred maintenance. But the fact of the matter is, we're letting these, if we want to talk about influences on development patterns, if we build these 5 schools in the county and at the edge of town, that's where people are going to go. That's where the young families coming to this town are going to want to be. Is that what we want to do? Do we want to just take our central business district and the heart of our town with the older homes and the people who live there and the kids who live there, and just say, well, tough luck, you're old and you got to go? It's probably true for me, but it doesn't have to be true for the schools. It's not, we can't do this bond because if we do it, we have built in a permanent change to this community which will drive people into the valley and not into the city. The city, when you vote on this bond, if you live in the city, you will pay about 2/3 of the bond. For every dollar that this bond raises, people who live in the city will pay 2/3 of that dollar, and people who live out there will pay 1/3 of that dollar. Now, I'm not saying that that should make the decisions for us, but if we're going to build schools in big schools out there and new schools out there, that's where we're going to drive people to build.
Okay, so we're gonna stop the questions. We're gonna close. Now you want a rebuttal?
Can I take my rebuttal?
Yes.
I totally appreciate the concern that you expressed, Mr. Nicholson, but I think that that's not how it's played out in Helena. By all accounts, Jim Darcy is in dire need of something. It's a stick-built building and a bunch of modulars, and it hasn't slowed down development in the valley. They're still building out in the valley, and the school is in awful shape. I don't think that having a better school there is necessarily going to speed it up. And as for our current situation, we actually had some friends who were moving to town very recently, and they asked, where should we move? We want to live, in a tree-lined street in the center of town. Well, don't move into my neighborhood because we don't have a school. I mean, I don't think that people have developed in the valley even when there weren't adequate school capacity there, and I don't think that improving the existing school is going to change that. I also think that we're one school district and we belong to each other whether we like it or not. We have a shared future together whether we like it or not, and we have to work together to move into that future whether we appreciate the way the valley has developed or not.
Thank you.
20 seconds.
Well, hold on. So I think we all got rebuttals there. So what I want to do is move to closing. So Monica's gone last, I think, every time. So on closing, you can go first, and then we'll alternate, and let's do 3 minutes closing. So go ahead.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, for listening to us. I think it's very unfortunate that we're here. I think it's very unfortunate that this has been styled as a debate. It would be lovely if we could be having a citizens forum talking about how to move forward together. I think that it's necessary to pass a bond for Helena, and I think that we can come together and do something that will work. We do have a template in the Mosaic Report. So it's not this bond. It's not today. That doesn't mean that it has to be 3 years away. It doesn't mean that we have to go back and have the paralysis that everyone's so frustrated with. We can come together. We can be better than this. And I think it's unfortunate that we're, when you have Alan Nicholson and Cindy Lewis on opposite sides of a bond, I think we need to revisit how we got there. There's just something about that I think needs to be considered. I don't think we should rely on anecdotes. I have a friend, I know somebody. Let's look at facts and evidence. There's a lot of it in this Mosaic Report. Let's look at the data. Who lives where? Why are kids going? Why are parents choosing different places? Why are they taking their kids to different schools? Why is that happening? What are the problems? What problem are we trying to solve? Let's articulate that instead of getting $70 million and doing something with it, because we're all so fed up. We haven't done anything in years. There's not been a boundary line adjustment. We got to do something. Let's stop. Let's take a deep breath. We can solve this problem together. Let's look at the facts, look at the data. We have a very, very recent vote. Very recent. Look at the precincts. Look at who voted for the levy. Look at where that passed and where it didn't pass, because there are precincts that failed that levy. So who's paying for this bond? Who supports the bond, and how will it get passed? Let's not fracture our community here. Those of us who live in town live here for a reason. And we can have the things that we wanted. We want our small schools. We want walkability. We want to preserve the historic buildings. We can have that. We might not be able to have every single building as it exists today, and that's okay. I haven't heard one parent say, over my dead body, will you take down any school? This discussion is open, and we have reasonable people talking about it. The people in the valley can live there and have the lifestyle that they wanted when they chose that, and we can all support each other. Helena is a stable, relatively homogeneous community. We have enormous strengths. Let's use those. Let's come together. Let's get a bond that we can all stand behind, because I want to vote yes, but I won't. I'll vote no, because every no is a yes, and I want to say yes to our community. I wanted to say yes to our small schools. I want to say yes to our teachers. And for those reasons, I'm saying no to this bond. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. Ellen? Ellen, sorry.
Okay. I thank you all for being here as well. One of the things that I'd like to talk about that we haven't talked about to any extent tonight is how would you calculate the price of this bond in regard to your property? And when you look at the information sheet right here, there is a Department of Revenue website where you can look up the value of your property as it is appraised, or is it the market value is assigned by the Department of Revenue. That's a very key number. So, you know, if you think your house is worth $200,000, you go see what the Department of Revenue has valued it at. Then you go to the next website, Bond Information, Helena Schools, and there is a formula and a worksheet there that shows you exactly how to calculate using your appraisal value or your market value for tax purposes times the mill levy, the mills, and it tells you how to do the mills because we don't spend mills anymore. And it is important that you actually understand what the cost of the bond would be for your property, and it's all spelled out here if you're willing to take a little bit of time. And there are many of us who would be willing to help you go through those steps if you are uncomfortable doing that by yourself. One of the things that I think is very important for us to acknowledge is that there is no perfect bond. There are thousands of combinations and permutations of how we can address our facilities needs. The needs are so numerous and so great that, you know, every one of us in this room would draw a different picture for a bond. And the reality is that a school board is a legislative body and has to, among itself, come to an agreement so that a majority can support a package. And that's what this is a result of. We, as school board members, we came from different perspectives. We had different preferences, but none of us got to design it just like we wanted. And on a go-forward basis, as many times as we might discuss these issues, I think we'll end up in the same place, that there's give and take, and that's what this bond represents. It's not perfect, and we didn't have enough money to, there isn't enough money to come to perfect in one step, but we need to take a step. We can't delay this longer. It's time to invest in our kids' future. This community doesn't have to have kids trying to learn in bad places. We shouldn't wait until more buildings fail. We need our wonderful staff to have the opportunity to do their very best for kids. It's time to say yes for kids now. This is a prudent plan. We can't afford to wait. Building and bonding costs will only increase. We have good market rates available to us today. If we delay this further, will we have as good a rates? Probably not, and certainly possibly not. But why gamble when this is a bond that will help our kids? A child is only in kindergarten one time, and you think about that child's experience and how it can be way better than it's going to be for my grandson who goes next year to a basement without windows. A whole generation of kids has gone through school while we've been discussing facilities. This is about our kids, and we need to be in their court now.
Thank you. Alan?
Well, I couldn't agree more that we should do something for all of our kids. And I couldn't agree more that our schools are in bad shape and that we need to do something, and we need to do it as fast as we can. We're not doing something for all of our kids. We're just not. We're doing something for some kids. The kids that will be in new or remodeled schools, the 5 schools I've been talking about all night, will have a lot done for them, those kids. The remainder of the kids in the elementary district will not. And guess what? There are more of those kids than there are kids in those schools. The middle school kids, where the schools are overcrowded, rapidly deteriorating, have millions, $13 million worth of deferred maintenance, will have nothing done for them, not one single thing. And if you think spending $8 million on the remainder of the neighborhood schools in this center of this city, when they have almost $30 million worth of deferred maintenance, is going to bring them up to speed, or even close to it, or make them really habitable schools, or make them better places, it's not. This bond is building permanent infrastructure. The school at Smith will be there for 50 or 75 years. We're going to need to find another 200 or more kids to go to school there if every kid in that enrollment area goes to Smith, which they won't, because there are other programs that kids go to. So we're gonna relieve and nobody's talking about not doing something at Darcy, and I just wish we'd stop saying that. We're not talking about that. And I remind you that only Darcy and Warren have less capacity than there are kids. Rossiter actually has fewer kids in it this year than it had last year. Rossiter only has, I think, 140 seats more than there are kids in the enrollment district at Rossiter. That's just a plain old fact. Most of those kids to fill that up, come from Darcy. It's, as I said before, 3 miles down a paved road. So it's not a terrible amount of suffering. But what we're going to wind up doing when we build these schools for 50 or 75 years, we're going to be busing kids over to Smith. We're going to be busing kids out of the city out to Warren. And I think it's fine to say, if you haven't studied the issue, that building these big new schools in the valley won't cause a dislocation in how this community in this area is developed. But you'd just be flat wrong about that. There's a science to development, and I've been studying it for way too long. There's a direct correlation between where your schools are and where people want to locate. And the demographers, I believe, they were in this room, they were in some room somewhere, when they came to report to the board, reported that countrywide and in this town, that over time we would see an in-migration into town. It's happening all over the country. It won't happen here if we have schools that are inadequate in every way to serve those kids. So if we want to serve all kids, we should be serving the kids at Bryant, at Hawthorne, at Kessler, and maybe the kids here in Ray Bjork and the other neighborhood schools. We're not going to do that. The reason we need to vote against this bond, it's true, there are many things we could do, hundreds, thousands. But doing this particular thing is a permanent just acquiescence to a big school model on the periphery of town and 10 miles out of town. Schools that are on septic tanks, wells, volunteer fire departments, and the sheriff for its police. No commercial buildings of any size are built in the county. And it's for those reasons. We want city services, and we want to build our community where people are close. This will destroy the fabric of this community, not just where we put our buildings, but also the fabric of our support for each other and for the schools.
Thank you, Alan. Jennifer.
I think we all live in Helena because it's a good place. And even when we disagree on things, even when you disagree on things as personal and powerful as the very school where your kid goes, we're basically friends and we have shared values, across our community. But our current school system doesn't support those very shared values. There are numerous anecdotes which add up to fact that it's just failing across the board in so many places. I think this bond does do something for all kids. It doesn't do every single thing. As Ellen said, we can't afford to do every single thing. But it's such a huge step in the right direction that to stall again over details and to stall really over fear. And I totally understand the fear. I totally understand the confusion. I totally understand the distrust that we've grown to have in decision makers. I mean, I really don't, not to beat a dead horse, but I don't think anyone feels it as powerfully as Central. I mean, our school was the topic of a 17-month discussion about whether we should close it or open it or keep it open, and we decided, let's keep it open. And 4 months later, it closed like that. I mean, yeah, we feel that confusion and that frustration very deeply. But if we stay in those feelings and we allow those feelings to guide us, we'll never do anything. I think it's time to move forward. I think this bond takes us there.
Thank you all. This was a fabulous discussion. Thanks for volunteering your time to come up here and speak publicly about it. Thank you all for attending. If you want to see a list of the rebroadcasts that'll be on Helena Civic Television, I got it right up here. Have a good night. Drive home safe.